For thousands of years, the Bible has preserved stories that reveal not only faith and miracles, but also the complexity of human nature. Stories about loyalty, betrayal, temptation, and the consequences of a single decision. Among these narratives, there is one that is surprisingly short, yet powerful enough to provoke questions even today. It is the story of a woman whose name is never mentioned in the biblical text. Yet her actions changed the life of one of the most important figures in the entire book of Genesis. She is known simply as the wife of Potiphar, and the moment she crossed paths with a young Hebrew named Joseph became one of the most dramatic turning points in his entire life. But before we reach that intense moment, we need to understand how Joseph even arrived in the house of Potiphar in the first place. Joseph was not an ordinary young man. He was the son of Jacob, a boy who had grown up surrounded by family but also by jealousy. His father loved him deeply, and that love was obvious to everyone around him. Joseph even received a special robe from his father, something that symbolized favoritism and attention. Yet that same favor created resentment among his brothers. And when Joseph began sharing dreams that suggested he would one day rise above them, their jealousy turned into something darker. Eventually, the unthinkable happened. Instead of protecting their brother, they betrayed him. They sold him to traveling merchants who carried him far away from his home into Egypt. Imagine what that must have felt like for a young man. One moment he is with his family, and the next he is alone in a foreign land, stripped of freedom and sold as a slave. Everything familiar was gone. His home, his family, his future as he once imagined it. Yet this moment of betrayal became the beginning of a path that would eventually lead Joseph into the center of one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was not an ordinary Egyptian. The Bible describes him as an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, which means he held a position of authority and influence. His house was large and well organized, filled with servants and responsibilities. And in this house, Joseph began his new life as a slave. What happened next is remarkable. Even though Joseph had lost everything, the biblical text says that the Lord was with him. And slowly, the people around him began to notice something unusual. Everything Joseph managed seemed to succeed. Tasks were completed well. Responsibilities were handled with wisdom. Over time, Potiphar himself recognized this pattern. He began to trust Joseph more and more. Eventually, Joseph was placed in charge of the entire household. Imagine the transformation. A young man who had arrived in chains was now responsible for overseeing the daily operations of a wealthy Egyptian household. Potiphar trusted him so deeply that he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. At first glance, it might seem like Joseph's life had finally stabilized. But it is exactly at this point that the story begins to shift in a direction no one could have predicted. The biblical narrative introduces a small but important detail about Joseph. It says that he was well-built and handsome. In other words, Joseph possessed an appearance that naturally drew attention. And inside Potiphar's house, there was someone who eventually noticed. Potiphar had a wife, a woman living in comfort, surrounded by wealth and influence. Yet the text hints that something inside her began to change when she noticed Joseph. At some point, her attention turned into desire. The Bible describes the moment very directly. One day, she looked at Joseph and spoke words that would change everything. She said, "Lie with me." Pause for a moment and picture the situation. A young slave living in the house of a powerful official. The wife of that official approaches him with a demand that could destroy everything. What would you do in that moment? Would fear make you obey? Would temptation make you hesitate? Or would you find the strength to refuse even though the consequences might be severe? These questions are what make this story so powerful, because it places Joseph in a situation where one decision could shape the rest of his life. Joseph did not remain silent. Instead, he responded with clarity and conviction. He explained that Potiphar had trusted him with everything in the house. Nothing had been withheld from him except Potiphar's own wife. To betray that trust would be a terrible wrong. But Joseph went even further than that. He said that such an act would not only be a betrayal of Potiphar, but also a sin against God. This detail reveals something important about Joseph's character. His decision was not based merely on fear of consequences, it was rooted in his understanding of what was right. Yet the story does not end with that single moment. The wife of Potiphar did not give up. Day after day, she continued speaking to him. Day after day, she tried to persuade him. This part of the story reflects something deeply human about temptation. Rarely does it appear only once. More often, it returns again and again, testing a person's resolve over time. Perhaps you have experienced something similar in your own life. Maybe you have faced situations where the real challenge was not the first moment of temptation, but the repeated pressure that followed. Joseph found himself in exactly that situation. Each day he had to make the same decision again. And each day, he chose to refuse. But then came the day when everything changed. Joseph entered the house to perform his duties just as he had done many times before. Yet on that day, something was different. None of the other servants were inside. The house was empty. And suddenly, the wife of Potiphar seized the opportunity. She grabbed his garment and repeated her demand. "Lie with me." This was the most dangerous moment Joseph had faced. No witnesses, no protection, only a choice that had to be made in seconds. Many people might have given in under those circumstances. Yet Joseph reacted in a way that still surprises readers today. Instead of arguing or hesitating, he fled. He left his garment in her hand and ran out of the house. Imagine that scene for a moment. A young man escaping so quickly that he abandons part of his clothing just to get away. It was a desperate decision, but also a powerful one. But what happened next is where the story becomes even more intense. The wife of Potiphar suddenly found herself standing alone with Joseph's garment in her hand. Think about what that moment might have felt like for her. Was she angry that Joseph rejected her? Was she embarrassed that her authority had failed to control him? Or was she afraid that someone might discover what had just happened? Whatever the reason, her reaction was immediate. She called the servants of the house and presented Joseph's garment as evidence. And then she told a story that reversed the truth. She accused Joseph of trying to assault her and claimed that he ran away only when she screamed for help. In a single moment, the narrative changed. The man who had done everything to avoid wrongdoing was now portrayed as the attacker. This moment raises a question that resonates even today. How quickly can a reputation be destroyed by a false accusation? How easily can the truth be twisted when power and emotion collide? When Potiphar returned home later that day, his wife repeated the same story to him. The reaction was swift and severe. Joseph was thrown into prison. Once again, he lost everything: freedom, position, future, all gone because of a decision he had refused to make. And this part of the story invites another difficult question. Why do bad things sometimes happen even when someone chooses to do the right thing? Perhaps you have wondered the same thing in your own life. Perhaps you have faced moments where honesty or integrity seemed to lead to hardship rather than reward. The story of Joseph does not ignore this reality. Instead, it acknowledges it openly. Joseph's refusal to betray his values did not protect him from suffering. In fact, it led him directly into a prison cell. Yet the story is far from finished, and what happens next will begin to reveal that even the darkest moments can become the beginning of something far greater. And it was inside that prison, a place that seemed like the end of every possibility, that the story began to move in a direction no one could have predicted. Joseph had been betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, falsely accused by the wife of a powerful man, and now he found himself locked behind stone walls with criminals and forgotten men. For many people, that would have been the moment when hope completely disappeared. Yet the biblical narrative reveals something surprising about Joseph, even in this dark place. The text says that the Lord was with him, even in prison, even when everything appeared to have collapsed. Slowly, the same pattern that had appeared in Potiphar's house began to emerge again. Joseph gained the trust of the prison warden. The guard responsible for managing the prisoners began to notice Joseph's character, his reliability, and his ability to handle responsibility. Over time, Joseph was placed in charge of many of the tasks inside the prison. It is remarkable when you think about it. A slave who became a steward in a wealthy house now became a trusted figure inside a prison. Yet while Joseph's life was slowly stabilizing again, one question remained hidden in the background of the story. What happened to the woman who had accused him? The wife of Potiphar disappears from the biblical narrative after that moment. Her name is never mentioned, and the text does not describe her life afterward. But her actions had already set something in motion that would change the future in ways she could never have imagined. This detail makes her one of the most mysterious figures in the entire book of Genesis. Why did she react the way she did? Was it anger because Joseph rejected her? Was it humiliation because someone she considered beneath her refused her command? Or was it fear that the truth might come out and damage her own reputation? Think about that question for a moment. When pride is wounded, how often do people react in ways that cause harm to others? How often do emotions lead to decisions that cannot be undone? If you were in Joseph's position, how would you feel knowing that your entire future had been destroyed by a lie? Write your thoughts in the comments because this part of the story touches something very real in human experience. But Joseph's story inside the prison continued to unfold. One day, 2 new prisoners arrived. They were not ordinary men. One was the chief cupbearer of Pharaoh, the man responsible for serving the king's drink, and the other was the royal baker. Both had somehow offended Pharaoh and were placed under guard in the same prison where Joseph was held. After some time, both men experienced dreams during the same night. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they were troubled. Their expressions revealed confusion and fear. Joseph asked them why they looked so distressed. They explained that each of them had experienced a dream, but no one could explain what it meant. Joseph responded with a statement that reveals his faith even in captivity. He said that interpretations belong to God. Then he invited them to tell him their dreams. The cupbearer spoke first, describing a vine with 3 branches that produced grapes, which he pressed into Pharaoh's cup before placing it in the king's hand. Joseph listened carefully and then explained the meaning. Within 3 days, Pharaoh would restore the cupbearer to his position. Encouraged by this interpretation, the baker then described his own dream. He carried 3 baskets of bread on his head, but birds came and ate the bread from the basket. Joseph again explained the meaning, but this time the outcome was darker. Within 3 days, the baker would be executed. Exactly 3 days later, Pharaoh held a celebration and everything happened exactly as Joseph had predicted. The cupbearer returned to his position and the baker was put to death. Before the cupbearer left the prison, Joseph asked him for something simple. "Remember me when you return to Pharaoh. Tell him that I was brought here unjustly." Joseph hoped that this connection might finally bring him freedom. But the story takes another painful turn. The cupbearer forgot him, not for a few days, not for a few weeks. 2 entire years passed while Joseph remained in prison. Imagine the silence of those years. Imagine waiting for someone who promised to remember you. Have you ever experienced something similar? A moment when you believed help was coming but nothing changed? Moments like that can test a person's faith deeply. Yet the story shows that Joseph continued to wait, and then suddenly everything changed. Pharaoh himself began to have disturbing dreams. In one dream, he saw 7 healthy cows coming out of the Nile, followed by 7 thin cows that devoured the healthy ones. In another dream, 7 full heads of grain were swallowed by 7 thin heads. These dreams troubled Pharaoh so deeply that he summoned all the wise men and magicians of Egypt. Yet none of them could explain what the dreams meant. At that moment, the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. He told Pharaoh about the young Hebrew in prison who had correctly interpreted dreams. Joseph was quickly brought before the king. Imagine the contrast of that moment. A man who had been living as a prisoner, suddenly standing in the presence of the most powerful ruler in Egypt. Pharaoh explained his dreams and asked Joseph if he could interpret them. Joseph answered with humility. He said that he himself could not interpret dreams, but that God could provide the answer Pharaoh needed. Joseph then explained that the dreams were a warning about the future. 7 years of great abundance were coming to Egypt, followed by 7 years of severe famine that would consume the land. But Joseph did not stop there. He suggested a plan. During the years of abundance, Egypt should gather and store grain so that the nation would survive the coming famine. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed by Joseph's wisdom. They recognized that this man possessed a unique understanding and leadership ability. In an astonishing decision, Pharaoh appointed Joseph to oversee the entire plan. In a single day, Joseph's life changed completely. The man who had been a slave and prisoner became the second most powerful ruler in Egypt. When we step back and look at the entire story, something extraordinary becomes clear. The false accusation of Potiphar's wife seemed like a disaster. It led Joseph into prison and destroyed the life he had built in Potiphar's house. Yet without that moment, Joseph would never have met the cupbearer and the baker. Without that meeting, he would never have stood before Pharaoh. And without standing before Pharaoh, he would never have risen to power in Egypt. This realization raises a powerful question. Could it be that events which appear tragic in the moment sometimes become part of a much larger story? That does not excuse the actions of those who cause harm, but it does reveal that even painful events can lead to unexpected outcomes. The story of the wife of Potiphar remains a warning about the consequences of pride, desire, and false accusation. Yet Joseph's response to her actions reveals something equally powerful about integrity and perseverance. Now think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever experienced a situation that seemed unfair at first, but later opened the door to something greater? Write your answer in the comments, because many people discover that the hardest chapters of their lives eventually lead to unexpected opportunities. And if stories like this one fascinate you, stories where ancient events reveal deep truths about human nature, faith, and the consequences of our choices, then follow this channel, because there are many other mysterious and dramatic stories hidden inside the Bible that continue to challenge and inspire people thousands of years after they were first written.